The voice from the human ship hung in the air of the sensor bay like smoke that refused to fade. And Yuna could still hear those words echoing in her mind, even after the transmission ended. "We would like to talk." Commander Rim moved to the communication console and sent an urgent message to Central Command. And his fingers trembled as he typed out a report describing what had just happened. The response came back faster than Yuna had ever seen from military headquarters. And the orders were clear and absolute. Do not respond to the human vessel under any circumstances, and maintain complete communication blackout until further notice. Yuna read the orders and felt something twist in her stomach, because hiding from a problem had never made it go away, and she doubted it would work now. "Sir, this is a mistake," she said, and her voice was stronger than she expected it to be. "They know we are here, and pretending otherwise will only make things worse." Commander Rim turned to face her with eyes that showed exhaustion and fear in equal measure. And he let out a long breath before speaking. "I agree with you, Lieutenant. But those are our orders, and we must follow them. Our orders are based on fear, not logic," Yuna replied, and she stood up from her chair to face her commander directly. "If the humans wanted to destroy us, they would have attacked already. But instead they stopped at the edge of our sensors and asked to talk like civilized beings." The commander rubbed his forehead with his fingers and closed his eyes for a moment. And Yuna could see the weight of 300 years of history pressing down on his shoulders. "What do you suggest we do?" he asked quietly. Yuna looked at the communication console and then back at her commander. And she made a decision that she knew could end her career or her life or both. "I suggest we answer them," she said. Commander Rim stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the conflict in his expression as duty battled against common sense inside his mind. "If we disobey orders, we could be executed for treason," he said. "If we ignore the humans, we could be starting a war that will destroy our entire species," Yuna replied. "I think I know which risk I would rather take." The commander was silent for what felt like hours. And then he slowly nodded his head and stepped away from the communication console. "Do it," he said. "And may our ancestors forgive us both." Yuna sat down at the console and opened a channel to the human vessel. And her heart pounded so hard in her chest that she thought they might burst through her ribs. "Human vessel. This is Lieutenant Yuna So of Outpost 17, she said. And her voice only shook a little bit. "We are receiving your transmission. Please respond." The answer came immediately, as if the humans had been waiting right beside their own communication equipment for exactly this moment. "Lieutenant So." "Thank you for answering," said a voice that was warm and friendly, and nothing like what Yuna had expected from a species her people had tried to destroy. "My name is Captain Minjung Kang of the survey ship Horizon, and I am very glad to speak with you." Yuna felt her mouth go dry, and she had to swallow twice before she could form words again. "Captain Kang, I must ask you directly what your intentions are in approaching Valorian space." There was a brief pause before the captain responded. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sadness that surprised her. "We are not here for revenge, Lieutenant, if that is what you are worried about. And I understand why you would fear that given our shared history. Then why are you here?" Yuna asked. "We are here because something is coming," Captain Kang said. "Something that threatens every living being in this galaxy, including both humans and Valorians. And we believe that warning our neighbors is more important than holding on to old grudges." Commander Rim moved closer to the console and leaned in to hear better. And his expression shifted from fear to curiosity as he listened to the human speak. "What kind of threat?" Yuna asked. "May I transmit data to your station?" Captain Kang asked. "It will be easier to show you than to explain with words alone." Yuna looked at Commander Rim, and he gave her a small nod of approval. So she opened a secure channel for data transfer and watched as information began flowing from the human ship to her console. The data showed sensor readings from deep space, far beyond the regions that Valorian ships had explored in centuries. And the images made her blood turn to ice in her veins. A massive fleet of ships was moving through the galaxy, and these vessels were unlike anything in any database she had ever seen, with designs that looked organic and mechanical at the same time, like living machines built for destruction. "We call them the Devourers," Captain Kang explained, "and we have been tracking them for over 50 years as they move through distant regions of space, consuming every planet and every species in their path." "How many ships?" Commander Rim asked, speaking for the first time since Yuna had opened the channel. "At least 10,000. The captain replied. "And possibly many more that we have not yet detected." Yuna felt dizzy as she processed this information, and she understood now why the humans had returned after 3 centuries of silence. "They are heading toward this sector," she said. And it was not a question. "Yes," Captain Kang confirmed. "Our calculations suggest they will reach Valorian space in approximately 6 months. And after that, they will continue through the rest of the populated galaxy." "Why warn us?" Yuna asked. "After what our people did to yours, why would you care if we survive?" The captain was quiet for a moment before answering. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "We spent 300 years hiding in the darkness beyond the galactic rim," he said. "And during that time, we had many long conversations about who we wanted to be when we finally returned. And we decided that we would rather be remembered as the species that saved the galaxy than as the species that let old wounds destroy us all." Yuna felt tears forming in her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly before Commander Rim could notice. "We are not here for revenge," Captain Kang continued. "We are here to offer an alliance to any species willing to stand with us against the Devourers. And we hope that you will consider our offer." Before Yuna could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the station, and her sensor console lit up with new contacts dropping out of hyperspace. A Valorian strike fleet had arrived, and their weapons were already locked onto the human ship. "Captain Kang, you need to leave immediately," Yuna said urgently. "Our military has sent ships to destroy you." "I know," the captain replied calmly. "We detected them before they arrived. But we will not run away from this conversation." "They will kill you," Yuna said. "Perhaps," Captain Kang said. "But running would only prove that we came here with hostile intentions, and we did not. So we will stay and let your people decide what kind of future they want to build." The strike fleet moved into attack formation, and Yuna watched helplessly as the situation spiraled toward violence. She had to do something, but she did not know what the legends had returned with open hands instead of weapons. And now her own people were about to destroy the only hope the galaxy had for survival. 6 months had passed since that night in the sensor bay, when Yuna had first detected the human ship, and now she stood on the observation deck of the human flagship, Eternal Dawn, and watched the stars burn with the light of 1,000 weapons. The Allied fleet stretched across the void in formations that would have seemed impossible just half a year ago, with Valorian warships flying beside human vessels and ships from a dozen other species that had answered the call to stand against the darkness. Yuna had been promoted 3 times since the night she had defied orders and opened communication with Captain Kang. And now she served as the official liaison between the human and Valorian forces. She had spent the last 6 months learning about humanity, living among them and studying their ways and discovering that they were nothing like the monsters from the old stories. They laughed and cried and loved and feared just like her own people. And they had welcomed her aboard their ships with warmth and kindness that she had not expected or deserved. Captain Minjun Kang stood beside her on the observation deck, and his face was calm despite the terror that awaited them on the edge of sensor range. "Are you afraid?" Yuna asked him quietly, terrified. he admitted with a small smile. But fear has never stopped humans from doing what needs to be done. The Devourers had arrived exactly when the human calculations had predicted, and their fleet was even larger than the original estimates had suggested. 15,000 ships moved through space like a swarm of insects made from metal and hunger. And they had already destroyed the outer defense stations without slowing down. Admiral Park commanded the Allied fleet from the Valorian flagship Unity, and her voice came through the communication system with orders that every ship in the formation could hear. All vessels. This is Admiral Park. The enemy is entering optimal engagement range, and I am ordering all ships to commence attack. The Allied fleet surged forward like a single living creature, and the darkness of space erupted with weapons fire that painted the void in colors of blue and gold and brilliant white. Una watched through the observation window as the first wave of Allied ships collided with the Devourer Armada, and she saw vessels on both sides exploding into clouds of debris and flame. The battle was brutal and chaotic in ways that no simulation or training exercise could have prepared her for, and she felt her heart breaking with each Allied ship that disappeared from the tactical display. A Valorian cruiser took a direct hit and broke apart in a shower of metal fragments, and Una recognized the ship as one that had been stationed near her homeworld. A moment later, a human destroyer rammed itself into the side of a massive Devourer carrier, and both vessels vanished in an explosion that temporarily blinded the sensors. "Why do your people do that?" Una asked Captain Kang, her voice thick with emotion. "Why do they sacrifice themselves so readily?" The captain watched the battle with eyes that held sorrow and pride in equal measure. "Because we learned long ago that some things are worth dying for," he said, "and protecting the people we care about is at the top of that list." The Allied line began to buckle under the weight of the Devourer assault, and for a terrible moment, Una thought that all of their preparation and sacrifice would be for nothing. Then the human reserves entered the battle. 72 fresh warships dropped out of hyperspace behind the Devourer formation, and they unleashed a barrage of weapons fire that tore through the enemy ranks like a blade through cloth. The Devourers tried to turn and face this new threat, but the Allied fleet pressed forward and caught them in a trap that offered no escape. Una watched as human ships pushed through gaps in the enemy formation, absorbing damage that would have destroyed vessels from any other species, and they kept fighting even when their hulls were breached and their systems were failing. One human battleship had lost half of its structure to enemy fire, and instead of retreating, the crew piloted their crippled vessel directly into the heart of a Devourer command ship. The explosion took out 17 enemy vessels and created a hole in the Devourer formation that the Allies exploited with ruthless efficiency. "They are not fighting like warriors," Una whispered. "They are fighting like guardians protecting their family." Captain Kang nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with quiet pride. "We spent 300 years alone in the dark, Lieutenant, and during that time, we had nothing but each other to hold on to. And we learned that the only thing that matters in this universe is protecting the people who stand beside you." The tide of the battle began to turn as the Basid Devourer losses mounted beyond their ability to replace, and one by one the enemy ships began to fall back and regroup, but the Allies did not let them escape. Human ships led the pursuit with Valorian vessels following close behind, and they chased the Devourers across the sector and destroyed every ship that tried to flee. By the time the last Devourer vessel exploded in a burst of flame, the Allied fleet had lost nearly a third of its numbers, but they had won a victory that would be remembered for millennia. Admiral Park's voice came through the communication system one final time. "All vessels. The enemy has been destroyed and the threat has been eliminated. I want to thank every being who fought today for their courage and sacrifice." The observation deck fell silent as the weight of what they had accomplished settled over everyone. Like a blanket, Yuna stood beside Captain Kang and watched the stars return to their normal peaceful glow. And she felt tears streaming down her face without any shame or embarrassment. "Why did you come back?" she asked him, repeating the question she had asked during their first conversation. "After everything our people did to yours, why did you choose to save us?" Captain Kang turned to face her, and his eyes held a wisdom that came from centuries of suffering and survival. "We spent 300 years thinking about that question," he said, "and in the end we realized that revenge would only make us into the monsters your people believed we were. And we did not want to prove them right." He paused and looked out at the stars, at the debris of battle that would eventually fade into the cosmic background. "We chose to be better than our history," he continued. "We chose to be the kind of species that reaches out with open hands instead of clenched fists. And today, we proved the choice was the right one." Yuna reached out and took his hand in hers, and she squeezed it gently in a gesture of gratitude and friendship. "The legends were wrong about you," she said. Captain Kang smiled and squeezed her hand in return. "No," he said. "The legends were incomplete. They told stories about what we were capable of in war, but they never mentioned what we were capable of in peace." Yuna nodded and turned back to the observation window, and she watched as allied ships from a dozen different species began the long journey home. The Endless Ones had returned, and they had come not as conquerors seeking revenge, but as guardians offering protection. The legends would need to be rewritten, and Yuna knew exactly how the new stories would begin. They would begin with a young lieutenant who detected a human ship on her sensors and froze when she realized the legends were real, and they would end with a galaxy united in peace. Because one species had chosen forgiveness over hatred. The humans had taught them all what it truly meant to be endless. Not endless in war, but endless in hope. The Valorian strike fleet hung in space like a wall of metal and fury, and Yuna counted 12 warships with enough firepower to reduce a small moon to rubble. Admiral Sujin Park commanded the fleet from her flagship, and her voice crackled through the communication system with orders that left no room for interpretation. "Outpost 17. You are commanded to cease all communication with the enemy vessel immediately and assist in targeting calculations for our attack run." Commander Rim stood beside Yuna with his jaw clenched tight, and she could see him struggling with the weight of what they were being asked to do. "Admiral Park," Yuna said into the communication channel, "the human vessel has not shown any hostile intent and has come here with a warning that we desperately need to hear." "Lieutenant, you are speaking out of turn, and I suggest you remember your rank before I have you arrested for insubordination," the Admiral replied coldly, with respect. "Admiral, you need to see the data they have transmitted to us," Yuna said, and her voice grew stronger with each word. "There is a threat approaching our space that makes the humans look like friendly neighbors. The only threat I see is the ship in front of us," Admiral Park said, "and I intend to eliminate it before it can signal others of its kind." Yuna looked at the sensor display and saw that Captain Kang had still not moved his ship or raised his shields, and he was simply waiting there like a person offering their hand to someone who might bite it off. "Captain Kang," she said, switching to the channel with the human vessel, "please raise your shields and prepare to leave. I cannot stop what is about to happen. We appreciate your concern." "Lieutenant So," the captain replied calmly, "but we came here to deliver a message and we will not leave until we have done so." "They are going to kill you," Yuna said, and she felt desperation clawing at her chest like a trapped animal. "Then we will die having done the right thing," Captain Kang said, "and our people will know that we tried to help even those who once tried to destroy us." Commander Rim placed his hand on Yuna's shoulder and squeezed gently, and when she looked up at him, she saw determination in his eyes that had not been there before. "Do it," he said quietly. Yuna understood what he meant without needing explanation. And she turned to her console and began typing commands that would change everything. She accessed the station's broadcast system and linked it to the fleet's communication network. And then she uploaded all of the data that Captain Kang had transmitted about the Devourers. "What are you doing?" Admiral Park demanded as her screens began filling with images of the alien fleet and sensor readings from beyond the galactic rim. "I am showing you the truth." "Admiral," Una said, "the humans did not come here to attack us. They came to warn us about something that will destroy everything we have ever built." The communication channel went silent as the Admiral and her officers reviewed the data. And Una watched the sensor display with hearts pounding as she waited to see if her gamble would pay off. The images showed planet after planet being stripped bare by the Devourer fleet. And the sensor readings confirmed that this armada was heading directly toward Valorian space with no sign of changing course. "This could be fake," one of the fleet officers said. "The humans could have created this data to trick us. To what end?" Commander Rim asked, speaking into the channel for the first time. "If they wanted to destroy us, they could have simply attacked without warning. But instead they sent a single unarmed survey vessel to talk." Admiral Park was quiet for a long moment. And Una could imagine her sitting on the bridge of her flagship, trying to process information that contradicted everything she had been taught to believe. "Human vessel." The Admiral finally said, "This is Admiral Sujin Park of the Valorian Defense Fleet, and I am ordering my ships to stand down while we discuss this situation." Una let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and she felt tears of relief running down her face as the weapons locks on the strike fleet disengaged one by one. "Thank you, Admiral," Captain Kang said, and his voice carried genuine warmth and gratitude. "I know this decision was not easy for you." "Do not thank me yet," Admiral Park replied. "I have many questions, and I expect honest answers." "You will have them," the captain said. "Over the next hour." Una listened as Captain Kang explained everything to the Admiral and her officers. He told them how humanity had survived the Great Purge by fleeing to hidden colonies beyond the edge of known space, and how they had spent 3 centuries rebuilding their civilization in secret while watching the galaxy from the shadows. He described how human scouts had first detected the Devourers 50 years ago, and how they had tracked the alien armada as it consumed everything in its path across thousands of light years. He explained that humanity had debated for decades about whether to return and warn the same species that had tried to wipe them out, and in the end they had decided that saving innocent lives was more important than holding on to anger and pain. "We have a fleet waiting at coordinates I will transmit to you," Captain Kang said. 72 warships with the most advanced weapons humanity has ever built. And they are ready to stand beside anyone willing to fight. "Why should we trust you?" Admiral Park asked, and her voice was softer now than it had been at the start of this conversation. "Because you have no choice," the captain replied honestly. "The Devourers will be here in 6 months, and they will not negotiate or show mercy. And the only chance any of us have is to face them together." Admiral Park was silent for several seconds before she spoke again. "I need to contact my government and discuss this with people above my rank," she said. "But I give you my word that we will not attack your vessel while these discussions take place. That is all we ask." Captain Kang said. Una slumped back in her chair and felt exhaustion washing over her like waves crashing against the shore. And Commander Rim stood beside her with an expression of wonder and disbelief on his face. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait," Commander Rim replied. "And we hope that our leaders have enough wisdom to see what is right in front of them on the sensor display." The human ship remained stationary and patient. And somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy, a fleet of 72 vessels waited for the call that would bring them into the light. The legends had offered their hand in friendship. And now the Valorians had to decide whether to take it. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. and Yuna knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Lieutenant Yuna So sat alone in the sensor bay of Outpost 17, her 4 eyes scanning the endless rows of data that scrolled across her screens. And she fought against the heavy weight of boredom that pressed down on her like a blanket made of stones. The night shift at the edge of Valorian space was the quietest assignment in the entire military. And nothing ever happened here, because nothing had happened here for 300 years. Not since the Great Isolation began and her people retreated from the galaxy to hide in this forgotten corner of the universe. She stretched her long arms above her head and let out a yawn that showed all 3 rows of her teeth. And she wondered why she had ever thought joining the Border Patrol would be exciting or meaningful in any way. The sensor station hummed around her with the soft sounds of machines doing their work, and the lights flickered in patterns that she had memorized during her first week on duty. And she could predict exactly when each system would beep or chirp or flash. Her grandmother had told her stories about the old days when Valorian ships traveled across the galaxy and traded with dozens of different species. But those days were long gone, and now her people lived in isolation and pretended the rest of the universe did not exist. Yuna reached for her cup of warm tea and took a sip. And she was about to pull up an entertainment program on her personal screen when something strange caught her attention. One of the long-range sensors had detected an energy signature at the very edge of its range, and the reading was faint but steady and moving in a direction that would bring it closer to Valorian space. She sat up straight in her chair and placed her cup down with careful hands. And she began to run diagnostic programs to make sure the sensor was working correctly, because there had to be some kind of mistake. No ships came to this region of space, because everyone had forgotten the Valorians existed. And that was exactly how the government wanted things to remain. Hidden and safe and completely alone. The diagnostic came back clean, and the sensor was working perfectly. And the energy signature was real and growing stronger with each passing minute. Yuna pulled up the ship identification database and began running the unknown signature through every pattern recognition program she had access to. And she watched as the computer rejected match after match because nothing in their records looked anything like this vessel. Her hearts began to beat faster in her chest, all 3 of them pounding in a rhythm that made her feel dizzy and afraid. And she reached for the communication panel to call her supervisor. Commander Taiho Rim answered on the 3rd signal, and his face appeared on her screen, looking tired and annoyed at being disturbed during his rest period. Lieutenant So. This had better be important, he said with a voice that carried the weight of someone who wanted to return to sleep. Sir, I have detected an unknown vessel approaching our sector, Yuna said. And she tried to keep her voice calm, even though her hands were shaking. The signature matches nothing in our database, and it is heading directly toward us. The commander rubbed his eyes with his fingers and let out a long breath that sounded like frustration and disbelief combined into one. Run the diagnostic again, he ordered. Our sensors are old, and they malfunction all the time. And I am certain this is just another ghost reading that will disappear in a few minutes. I already ran the diagnostic twice. Sir, Yuna replied. The signature is real, and it is getting stronger. Commander Rim stared at her through the screen for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from annoyance to concern as he realized she was not making a joke or a mistake. I will be there in 5 minutes, he said. And then the screen went dark. Yuna turned back to her sensors and watched the unknown ship continue its approach. And she decided to try something that she had never done before in her 3 years of service at this station. She accessed the historical archives, the ones that contain records from before the Great Isolation, and she began searching through files that had been locked away for centuries and marked with warnings about restricted access. The computer asked for her security clearance, and she entered her codes with trembling fingers. And she was surprised when the system accepted her request and began displaying ancient records that had not been viewed in generations. She found a section labeled as Legends and Myths, and she almost laughed at the idea that military archives would contain such things. But she opened the files anyway because she had no other options. The first document she found was a report from a Valorian scout ship that had encountered an unknown vessel 400 years ago, and the description of the energy signature made her blood turn cold in her veins. She read the words on her screen and felt her entire body go numb with a fear that reached down into the deepest parts of her soul. The signature matched a configuration that her ancestors had classified. As human, Yuna had grown up hearing stories about humans, and every Valorian child learned to fear them before they could even walk or speak. They were called the Endless Ones, the species that refused to surrender and refused to die and refused to accept defeat even when the entire galaxy united to destroy them. The old story said that humans were monsters who could survive anything, who adapted to every environment and overcame every obstacle, and kept fighting long after any reasonable creature would have given up. 300 years ago, a coalition of 17 species had decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist, and they had launched a campaign to wipe humans from the universe forever. The war had been brutal and terrible, and the humans had fought back with a fury that shocked everyone who faced them. And they had taken down entire fleets with nothing but damaged ships and dying crews. Eventually, the human worlds went silent, and the coalition declared victory. And everyone assumed that humanity had finally been destroyed, and the galaxy was safe. The Valorians had retreated to this distant corner of space to hide from the aftermath and to forget the terrible things they had done during the war. Yuna stared at her sensor readings and understood why the ship matched nothing. In their modern database, it matched something much older and much more frightening than anything she had ever imagined. The door to the sensor bay slid open, and Commander Rim walked in with quick steps, and he moved to stand beside her and look at the data on her screens. "What do you have?" he asked, and his voice was steady but his eyes showed fear. Yuna pointed at the energy signature and then at the historical match, and she watched the color drain from his face as he understood what they were seeing. "That is impossible," he whispered. "They are extinct. They have been dead for 3 centuries. The signature is a perfect match, sir," Yuna said, and her voice came out barely louder than a breath. They stood together in silence and watched the human ship change its course on the sensor display. And Yuna felt her heart stop beating for just a moment as she realized what was happening. The ship was no longer just approaching their region of space. It was heading directly toward their station. It had detected them. The legends were real, and they were coming. Commander Rim stood frozen beside Yuna for what felt like an eternity, and his eyes never left the sensor display that showed the human vessel moving toward them with a purpose that could not be mistaken for accident or coincidence. "Contact Central Command immediately," he finally said, and his voice cracked on the last word like ice breaking under too much weight. Yuna turned to her communication console and began transmitting an emergency signal to the military headquarters on their homeworld. And she included all the sensor data and historical matches in her report because she wanted someone with more authority to tell her she was wrong. The response came back within minutes, which told her that someone important was already awake and monitoring their channel. And the message was simple and direct: hold position and maintain observation, but do not engage or communicate with the unknown vessel under any circumstances. Commander Rim read the orders and nodded his head slowly, and then he began pacing back and forth across the sensor bay like a trapped animal looking for an escape that did not exist. "We need to know more," Yuna said quietly, and she turned back to the historical archives that she had begun searching before the commander arrived. "What are you doing?" Rim asked, and he stopped his pacing to watch her fingers move across the control panel. "I am accessing the restricted files from before the isolation," she replied. "If that ship is really human, then we need to understand what we are dealing with." The commander opened his mouth as if to object, but then he closed it again and gave her a small nod of approval, because he understood that knowledge might be the only weapon they had. Yuna dove deeper into the ancient records and found files that had been sealed by the highest levels of government, and she used emergency protocols to override the security locks because nothing in her training had prepared her for this situation. The first file she opened was a military report from the Great Purge, and it detailed the beginning of the war against humanity in cold and clinical language that made her stomach turn with disgust. The Coalition had decided to destroy humans not because they had attacked anyone or broken any laws, but because they were simply too successful at surviving and expanding across the galaxy. Humans had arrived on the galactic stage only a few centuries before the war, and in that short time they had spread to dozens of worlds and established trade relationships with hundreds of species and shown no signs of slowing down. The other species had looked at humanity and seen a threat that would eventually overwhelm everyone else, and they had decided to eliminate that threat before it grew too large to stop. Yuna read accounts of the first attacks, and she learned that the Coalition had struck without warning and destroyed human colonies while their inhabitants slept peacefully in their beds. The humans had been shocked and confused at first, unable to understand why the galaxy had turned against them when they had done nothing wrong. But their confusion did not last long. The next files documented the human response, and Yuna felt her blood run cold as she read about battles that should have been impossible. Human ships with damaged engines had rammed into Coalition vessels rather than surrender, and human crews had fought to the last breath, even when they were outnumbered 100-1. One report described a human colony that had been bombarded from orbit for 3 days straight, and when Coalition troops finally landed on the surface, they found that the survivors had built weapons from the wreckage and were waiting to ambush them. Another file told the story of a human captain who had piloted her crippled ship into the center of a Coalition fleet and detonated her reactor core, taking 17 enemy vessels with her into death. The Coalition had expected humanity to collapse within weeks, but the war dragged on for years, and the cost grew higher with each passing month. Yuna found a personal journal entry from a Valorian admiral who had commanded a fleet during the final phase of the war, and his words haunted her like ghosts from a nightmare. "We thought we were hunting prey," the admiral had written, "but we discovered too late that we had awakened predators beyond our understanding, and they made us pay for every centimeter of space we took from them in blood and fire and screaming." The war ended not with a final victory, but with a sudden silence, and the human transmission simply stopped one day and never resumed. The Coalition had declared success, and each species had retreated to their own territory to recover from wounds that would take generations to heal. But the admiral's final entry in the journal made Yuna's hand shake as she read it. "We did not win," he had written. "We simply stopped hearing them, and that terrifies me more than anything else. Because humans do not give up, and they do not surrender, and they do not die quietly in the dark. And I believe with all my soul that they are still out there somewhere, waiting and watching and remembering everything we did to them." Yuna closed the file and sat back in her chair, and she felt like she had aged 100 years in the span of an hour. Commander Rim had been reading over her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, she saw that his face had gone pale, and his hands were trembling at his sides. "Our ancestors tried to commit genocide," Yuna said softly, "and now the survivors have found us." The commander did not respond because there was nothing he could say that would make the truth any easier to bear. The sensor console beeped with a new alert. and both of them turned to look at the display with hearts pounding in their chests. The human ship had come to a complete stop, just outside their maximum sensor range. As if the crew knew exactly how far Valorian technology could see and had positioned themselves at the very edge of that boundary. It was a message without words. A demonstration of knowledge and capability that proved the humans had been watching and learning and preparing for this moment. Minutes passed in silence as Yuna and Commander Rim stared at the motionless vessel. And neither of them knew what to expect or what to do or what would happen next. Then, communication console lit up with an incoming transmission. And Yuna felt her throat tighten with fear as she saw the signal originating from the human ship. She looked at Commander Rim for guidance, but he simply stared back at her with eyes that held no answers. The transmission began playing automatically, and a voice filled the sensor bay that spoke perfect Valorian without any accent or hesitation. "We would like to talk," the voice said, and it was calm and gentle and carried none of the rage or hatred that Yuna had expected to hear. She sat in stunned silence and wondered if monsters could sound so human. And then she remembered that the humans were not the monsters in this story. Her people were. The voice from the ship waited patiently for a response. And Yuna understood that the next few moments would determine whether this encounter ended in peace or war. She looked at her commander and saw that he was frozen with indecision. And she knew that someone would have to make a choice soon. The legends had returned, and they wanted to talk. The question was whether anyone would have the courage to listen.